Welcome. I hope none of you came yesterday. I apologize for the hiccup with the timing. It was entirely my fault. I think I was looking at the wrong year. Anyway, at least all of you have made it back tonight if you did come yesterday. And I'm sure you'll find it worth coming twice if you have. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Morris. In this series, Paul is the first of our more local speakers. He comes to us from Victoria University in Wellington, but he's the first New Zealand-based speaker. And Paul is in the general overview that we set for this series for the lecturers that we invited was to ask them to reflect on the history, the current practice, and the future prospects for the academic study of religion, with a particular focus on New Zealand, but also more broadly. And Paul is superbly placed to comment on this. I would imagine that he's been a close observer of the scene in New Zealand for at least 3 and possibly 4 decades. He studied with with Lloyd Gearing at Victoria University in what must have been the 1970s.
Yes.
And then went to McMaster in Canada, and then on to Lancaster in Birmingham, where he taught me briefly. I'm not sure Paul remembers it. I don't remember much more than your hat that you used to wear at that time, and and Night, which you had us read in a first-year class, which was so two things I would say. So that was in the early 90s. In 1994, he returned to Victoria to succeed Gearing as the Professor of Religious Studies at Victoria University, where he has remained. He has held visiting appointments in various other places over the years in Santa Barbara, Boston, Oxford, Birmingham, and Queensland. But he has been, I think, probably the nearest thing that New Zealand has in our discipline to a public intellectual in our discipline, that is in religious studies. His interests are extremely wide-ranging in terms of his publications, but I think it's fair to say that in recent years in particular, his focus has been on issues not unconnected with what he's going to talk to us about tonight. That is the challenges posed by religious diversity, particularly for New Zealand. And Paul has published on issues in relation to the workplace, in relation to education. I came across a paper relating to circumcision, and all these questions of how a secular state should approach questions about religious diversity in an increasingly diverse country. Religiously diverse country. So Paul is superbly positioned to speak to us tonight, and we're very lucky to have him here, so please welcome him.
Well, thank you for the invitation and the introduction, and I've taken you at face value that this is a learned but wide-ranging audience. Religion at Otago seems to have a very simple appointments procedure. That is, they employ Victoria's former religious studies research fellows. So good evening to Ben, good evening to John, and it's really nice to see both of you. Thank you. But it's a particular delight to be here addressing you as part of the Seymour Memorial Lecture Series. Alby was delightful in the sense of being delight-filled, in the sense of being joyous. There are many connections between our two programs for the academic study of religion. We have many of Alby's books in our Trinity Newman Library, donated by former Phenom student Marinus LaRouge, who completed an MA with us on anti-Semitism in New Zealand between the wars. Albert, Lloyd, Colin, and Peter constitute the veritable 4 horsemen of religious studies in our country. I met Alby on a number of occasions, and I stayed with him on a number of occasions, with him and Alexa. I listened to New Orleans jazz in his house after mentioning that my wife and I had recently been to New Orleans, and after I made reference to having heard Benny Green playing sax at Ronnie Scott's, led to him finding a recording, that took a while, but a 1950s recording of Green playing at the Frith Street Club in Soho. Alby was a Presbyterian who had a particular passion for sculptures and imagery of the Madonna and Child. He had the manners and the way of a now lost generation. and he followed agendas set by that generation. His training was as a Protestant theologian and New Testament scholar, and he had a particular interest, and a much longer than his publications suggest, interest in religious arts in Oceania and the Pacific, and in religion and art more generally. I spent yesterday morning in the National Library reading Alby's autobiography. We don't have a copy in the Vic Library, but there is a copy in the National Library. According to the librarian, I'm the only person who ever read it, so this is really rather sad because it's an interesting piece. It's called More Than You Know, an autobiography edited by Seymour and R. Ovens by his children. He doesn't say so, but I suspect the title is a riff on Billie Holiday's More Than You'll Ever Know. But he doesn't say this, but I'm certain of it. I also looked briefly at the other 7 holdings at the National Library. I looked again at the Iconography of Religions, an introduction, Arts and the Religions of the Pacific, at the co-edited Helmut Rex collection, at Theology and Religious Studies, an overview about the department here, and at the Festschrift in his honor, Religious Studies in Dialogue. And finally, for the first time, at Symbols of Life, Freedom, Religion and Spirit, a collection of U3A lectures that he gave in his retirement. The last strikes you immediately at how close he was to Lloyd Gearing in scope, in theological purpose, and in historical references. I recently looked at Lloyd's reading list. He kept these little notebooks of everything he'd read and put numbers of ticks by them for the 1960s and early 70s. And they overlap heavily with Alby's reading list for a similar time. When Albert discussed Lloyd, he always used to make much of what he saw as a major difference. He once told me that I think religion, human consciousness, humanity begins with art, with representation, which he saw as being pre-linguistic, pre-language. And he thought that Lloyd thought that language was unthinkable without humanity and humanity without language. And so Alby thought this was a very profound distinction, but after reading through his autobiography, I'm much less convinced, and I'm not sure how significant this difference is. They struck me as much closer than I'd ever quite realized. Both were Protestant theologians of a particular era. Both were Presbyterian ministers with an interest in modernity and the legacy of Christianity in the context of New Zealand and the contemporary wider world. Both drew heavily, albeit differently, on Buber, on Tillich, on Bultmann, Feuerbach, and Gregor Smith. Many of these initially via theological hall. Lloyd is more Buberian and less Tillichian, and Alby had more and significant regional interests. Lloyd never really had any regional interests at all. Lloyd claims the title of Phenomenology of Religion for Alby's lectureship in the program, while Alby insists that religious studies began, page 162, in Canterbury with Jim Wilson and Colin Brown in 1960. So, I don't know, take your pick. Alby's PhD focused on tradition in the New Testament and led him to a lifelong commitment to a much greater significance on received tradition than for Lloyd. The SCM and dancing played a vital role in the intellectual and social development of both. And I have that from Lloyd 2 weeks ago, and where you could dance, where you couldn't, and both men were led out of the SCM by their desire to dance with young ladies in the 1940s. Now, their parallel projects and concerns will make up a very different sort of lecture, and they're a subject for a very separate address. The penultimate time I met Alby, we went unannounced, his suggestion, to the Otaku Marae, where, because we arrived at 10 to 8 in the morning, we woke the komatua up, who wasn't particularly pleased to see us, but he did graciously admit us into his sitting room while he went to the loo and changed out of his pajamas. I remember his amazing collection of martial arts videos. He returned more suitably attired and more formally welcomed us and invited us to join him for the cup of tea. He spoke, striking the ground with his tototuku, his talking stick. I was intrigued that his talking stick had a blank space among the carved faces. When I asked him who it was, he said, "Oh, it's my Danish grandfather." Talking later, on the way back to the university, Alby was shocked at this effacement and expressed surprise. One should never deny any part of oneself. And I think mostly that he didn't. An Island Bay boy, Alby grew up in Wellington and Masterton, attended Victoria, completing a BA and an MA degree there in history. He writes, "Victoria University College had something of a reputation for radicalism, atheism, socialism, and a most dubious morality." And he continues, a couple of pages later, "Wellington had a reputation of being a more secular city than any other major New Zealand city, such as Christchurch and Dunedin." Given the 2013 census figures, nothing much has changed, and we're certainly rising in the stakes of largely inebriated students doing vandalism around our city. We've taken you on that front too. Alby attended St Andrews on the Terrace, still Lloyd's haunt, but he was also an avid church hopper, and he seems to have recorded in his autobiography he went to every church in the Wellington region and in the Wairarapa too. He taught at Scots College after doing a teaching qualification and displayed his biblical expertise by threatening to chop a disputed spinning top in half, only to give it to the boy who cried out in alarm. Knew his Bible. Last week I took out Alby's MA thesis, awarded in 1947, from our university library. This is only the second time it's been taken out since 1947, so they're very specialist work. It's entitled Church and State in Education in Wellington, 1860 to 1900. And actually, it's a fine study. And I wrote about an article about religious education in New Zealand in 2013, and I didn't come across this, or it would have been very useful. It's a study that focuses on the context and reception and response to the 1877 Education Act, and its definition, its now infamous definition of education, as free, compulsory, and secular. It includes extensive reference to the Hansard debates and the Petitions Committee of 1883 and 1895. It's got a very interesting chapter on the Nelson system of Bible instruction that began in 1897 and is subject of a major complaint in the Tribunal of the Human Rights Committee at the moment. So it's a very relevant issue. It's got a rather lovely interview with the initiator of the Nelson scheme, Reverend James Mackenzie, who was living in Kelburn Parade, just along from the history department at the time Alby was doing his work. In a 1952 visit that Alby made to a Plymouth Brethren service held at an Anglican church hall in Devon in the south of England, he was taken aback when asked as he came up to go into the church, "Are you a believer?" An expert on secularity in New Zealand. His revealing reply is the only clear indication of his sense of identity at the time. He said, No, I'm a New Zealander." Which tells you a great deal about Alby. Now, his studies continued at Theological Hall, Knox College, and later in Manchester and at Göttingen universities. Then, like Lloyd, to rural ministry. Attracted by Rex's initiative for a new Otago post in the study of religion, and funded to do so, Alby went to the Department of History of Religions at Chicago. He took courses with Joseph Kitaga and Mircea Eliade as course on shamanism, and a second seminar with Eliade on sacred time and space. He went to a joint for one term, one trimester, a joint Eliade, a joint Eliade-Tillich seminar. It's very, very clear that he took very different things, according to his autobiography, from Tillich and from Eliade. From Eliade, he took very seriously a kind of theology, a theology of the hierophany, a theology of the accessing the sacred through manifestations of human productivity. Through art, through ritual, but for art very seriously for Alby. But theologically, he was more struck and more influenced, I think, by Tillich. He was particularly struck by Tillich's vision for a dialogue, quote, between Christian doctrine and the global religious history of mankind. And this came very close to some of Albert's later writings. And Tillich's understanding the significance of, quote, the rich religious symbols by which humans have understood themselves came in many ways to define Alby's own intellectual quest. He taught religious studies in Indiana, returned to Otago to teach phenomenology of religion. The first international speaker at the new venture was my Dr. Vara Ninian Smart. Before taking leave of Alby, there are two brief thoughts I want to share. Firstly, I don't understand what he means by it, but this is a little piece from Alby. He says, "My objection to the death of God theologians is that they've got no sense of humour." It's a very strange thing to have written, and I don't know how seriously to take it. And he continues, "And they suffer from insufficient humanity." And this was very strange. People like Hamilton and Althusser were, of course, about a kind of emptying out of the transcendent into a total immanence. And so I'm not sure what Alby means, but I'm intrigued. They were also, the Death of God's theologians, those two and that original collection on the Death of God, obsessed by the impact on them as Christians, of the Holocaust. And Alby never mentions the Holocaust in any of his writings. And certainly, this is strange, he had a kind of near obsession with German language, with German theology, and of post-war Germany, where he spent time at Göttingen and visited later. But he doesn't engage in any way with this set of references. So I'm intrigued in that. Alby wrote of God as the sense of presence available to all. A sense, he writes, that takes myriad forms, and this is my segue to religious diversity. That's it. Okay, the second part of what I want to say. The academic study of religion has been characterized by different fads and models, some of which create new research paradigms, while others are even more productive in reopening older, seemingly settled issues. What I'm going to refer to as the new religious diversity is of the latter type, and I hope to illustrate that this evening. Religious diversity is used in different ways by different thinkers, in a number of different fields, and more recently, differently again, way beyond the academy. It's become a policy term, an issue of governance, part of the language of public governance. Religious diversity is used primarily in two ways, and this is how I'm going to use it. Firstly, simply descriptively, that is to empirically register different religious groups in a given locale, a given time and place. Secondly, it's used normatively to evaluate factual diversity, descriptive diversity, as positive, as in the exhortation to celebrate diversity. Or more recently, I attended a seminar last month with Mei Chen in Auckland, which was called Diversity Dividend. And diversity dividend is, there are lots of New Zealanders, they're all very different, and guess what? You can cash in on it. It's a great thing. It's a business metaphor. But the issue here is simply that diversity, for those who use it in this way, in this normative way, is an unquestionable asset. This is much more problematic than it might first appear, and I've written on this, but I'm not going to elaborate here. But for example, Robert Putnam has persuasively demonstrated that religious diversity as normative value is very difficult. Religious diversity is clearly associated with higher levels of insecurity and unsettledness, and as Putnam shows definitively, people actually feel safer and happier, contentment scale in his book, with people they identify as like themselves religiously and culturally. It's sad, but we really don't like diversity very much, and we're happier with our own sort. It's interesting that Putnam argues this goes across economic barriers. And so you can be very rich. The example he takes is of living in Fifth Avenue. It's incredibly diverse. Or you can live in one of the outer New York boroughs where it's equally diverse. And these people score with very, very lowly on levels of security. So you can be rich and insecure. You can be poor and insecure. But people that are too different, too mixed causes problems. Now, this raises issues about that whole normative use. But it's this normative use I need to deal with just for a bit because of the size and complexity and prestige of a particular project. The second normative usage has in the last 2 decades, or so, often been referred to as religious pluralism. And that's the distinction made by Diana Eck is religious diversity is the fact, religious pluralism is this positive thing, as in Diana Eck's Harvard Religious Pluralism Project. I still refer to this as religious diversity, but I do use the term religious pluralism to refer to the specific set of positive evaluations of religious diversity, particularly in America and particularly associated with this and other like projects. I took part in the 2006 AAR panel with Eck on religious pluralism, in which she correctly presented religious diversity, in her case religious pluralism, as a vitally important new research priority and challenge for religious studies. In her address, it was clear for her that there were equally significant and urgent civil and theological challenges. In her address to the AR, she dealt with the religious studies challenge, the theological challenge, how Christians are going to make sense of this, and what she called the civil challenge, which is what's later called the management of religious diversity. Academically, the first category, she refers to the challenge of religious pluralism, quote, as the need to research the dynamics of religious life and identities today. Eck insisted that the interaction of religion with liberal human rights and democracy in the context of America has had, in her words, a powerful transformative effect on world religions, and that these in turn will impact on the co-religionists of these same faiths around the world. So in a part of her paper address, which she called her vision for the future, she sees feminist Muslims in the United States becoming standard bearers and models for Muslim women everywhere. The same for egalitarian Hindus, democratic Buddhist monks, and Christian evangelicals who, she says, will joyfully embrace other sexualities. It's a particular vision of religious pluralism. Although she insists that dialogue and encounter are processes, this is another paper, and thus not final, the intended direction and limits to open encounter are evident. I mean, she has a kind of program. I'm not at all sympathetic to this project as a normative program, and I certainly don't think it should be undertaken by university academics, as it's both beyond the usual remit of scholarship and it appears closed to any genuine interaction. What Eck does is assert the liberal model, and faiths need to adapt to it, although she insists this is actually what's happening. So it's a descriptive account of process, not just a claim, although it has this kind of aspirational element. I'm, however, partial to a rather different version or different understanding of the same phenomenon. It's what I call cosmopiety or cosmopolitan piety. That's the recognition of the religious rights of others by those who strongly identify religiously. Very often, cosmopietists, as I call them, have a penchant for mystical and experiential new communities. Cosmopiety, based on the notion of cosmopolitics, where I stole it from, was a radical attempt at moral and ethical consistency, proceeds from the position that my religious freedoms and rights entail necessarily the religious rights of others. And you'll notice here I've drifted from category 1, from being an academic enterprise, to a kind of theological and civil one. The sheer fact of increasing religious diversity fosters reflection on our own religion and its defense and parallels. The questioning of the validity of the faith of those we encounter inevitably raises issues about our own faith, with the surprising discovery that the justification for their faith often seems quite like ours. We find cosmopiety in middle-class Sufi evenings that I attended last year in Jakarta, in Jewish study groups and gatherings in Jerusalem and New York, and in Auckland and Wellington too, and in Christian circles globally. Cosmopiety differs from religious pluralism as being much less normative, more open to other religious influences and realities, and proceeds with a kind of intercultural understanding. And of course, I don't see it as a political agenda, but want it to be a useful conceptual and analytical category. The cosmo bit of cosmopiety inevitably extends responsibility, at least potentially cosmo, to all others. And there is some evidence to indicate that religious diversity itself, in some circumstances, encourages religious identity and creativity. And so there's a growing body of literature which makes it very, very clear that religious diversity with particular sets of circumstances actually increases religious identity, but also fosters what I call cosmopietist creativity, ways of thinking about the issues raised. Religious diversity in the first sense is hardly new, this descriptive sense. Different human communities have always interacted, including those that we might characterize as religiously different. I'll return a little below to the definition of religion. But past encounters have mostly been contentious, often violent, and frequently murderous. I refer to these as prejudicial pluralism. They're plural in the sense that they recognize the other as different, but they do so prejudicially. That is, they recognize the other as inferior, false, misguided, incomplete, distorted, partial, and not deserving of the inclusion under the same moral directives or responsibilities. Prejudicial pluralism can be seen as evident in the Islamic doctrines of Al-Kitab, or Abrahamic faiths, or the Jewish tradition that non-Jews are obligated not to convert to Judaism, but required to become B'nai Noach, sons of Noah, that is, to observe the 7 laws of Noah to be assured of a place in the world to come. Distinctions between higher and lower truths in Indic faiths, such as the Hindu distinction between Vivyahārika and Paramatha, these different viewpoints at different levels, and the Buddhist versions of the same. Christianity has been particularly problematic in this regard, although there have been more recently anonymous Christians, implicit Christians, in fact a whole lot of other weird Christians around. All historic religious traditions have prejudicial pluralistic models of their limited interreligious interactions. But why do these matter? Why should we be worried about what I call prejudicial pluralism? Mostly because they're endlessly invoked as the solution to contemporary religious diversity. I went to a seminar the year before last in Israel, a Lubavitch Chabad seminar on B'nai Noach. On the answer, we've got the answer. The answer is the Arabs have to do these 7 things. They're very, very lucky. I've got 613 commandments. Muhammad over there has only got 7. Isn't he lucky? And we have a solution. I spent time recently at the UNESCO chairs meeting and had a rather awesome row with a Tunisian professor, a Muslim, and who insisted that the solution to the Middle East is for Jews to just live under Muslim rule. What's the problem? It's mandated, it's in the Quran, it's in Surah 5. What is your issue? And these are perfect models of prejudicial pluralism. They recognize otherness very seriously, but not with a degree of equity or a degree of balance, and with exclusive moral models. These authoritative traditions are resurrected again and again as the answer to contemporary problems. And the Buddhist treatment of minorities in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, we've got people who work on both in the audience here, often entail what I see as Buddhist prejudicial models of pluralism. Very often they insist on recognizing other truths, but in a rather inferior way. I would also suggest, I did suggest this to Diana Eck, that her model of Christianity may be a model of prejudicial pluralism, but let's not go there. Now, when I talk about the new religious diversity, I'm referring to the last 30 or 40 years. And I'm referring to things that we deal with every day, with massive flows of migrants, largely of different religions, from Africa and Asia to Europe and the former settler colonies of the European empires, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, to the huge internal migrations from rural to urban across sub-Saharan Africa and across Asia, to the unprecedented rise of the religiously deinstituted, of those who declare no religion in increasing numbers across the so-called West. The revived and renewed post-secular politico-religious identities that arose in the 1970s, first among Muslims, then in the mid-70s among Christians, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and at the end of the 70s, increasingly among indigenous peoples. The rise of religious identity politics. The development of global markets for the exchange of goods and services and new modes of communication exponentially increases awareness and information about religious others, both excellent information and misleading information. And of course, both are worthy of our academic attention. I date this conveniently from the 1970s oil crisis via the Likud political victory in 1977, which first brought religious parties directly into the Israeli government, to the emerging successes against the USSR and the Iranian Revolution 2 years later. The same year also saw the founding of the Moral Majority by Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell Jr. has just been appointed as a special counsel and advisor to Donald Trump, rather strangely. In the same year, 1979, L.D. Avani became leader of the Bharatiya Janata Party. And this is the new context for religious diversity and a politicization of religion. New Zealand saw its first sizable Muslim, Hindu and Buddhist migrant communities in the 1980s after the 74, 87 and 91 migration law changes. Then there was 9/11, but I'm not going to go there. We can leave there. Religious fundamentalism, a term of exceedingly limited use, is not, as Diana Eck insists, the other big religious agenda concern alongside religious diversity, but is clearly an extreme form of religious diversity. I think that's a more sensible way to think of it. And I see the same drivers of religious diversity tied in with this extreme form of the same, of religious diversity. The new religious diversity is set again to be an election issue here and in Germany in September, as it was in the US last November and in France and Holland early this year. The new religious diversity has impacted on international trade and political relations, domestic employment, legal, educational and other policies. Almost all of our primary produce exports are halal and Sharia compliant. This new reality has yet to be studied systematically, but is a new focus for the study of religion. Eck's right in that sense. In particular, the impact on different religious communities of there being new and different religious communities alongside increasing numbers of ostensibly non-religiously identified people. This, along with refined analyses of the communities themselves, and I'm particularly thinking of the intersection of migrants and their ethnic histories with their religious identifications, gives you a much more nuanced picture of the religious demography of communities. So the Jewish community in New Zealand, for argument's sake, begins very, very at the beginning in the 1840s with Jews on the first boats. They came from London, the imperial hub. They tended in the earlier days to be those who were already settled in England. They're before the mass migrations from the Pale of Settlement. The next generation who come, they're very small numbers, come in the first decade of the 20th century, and they come via the Pale to London, out to the colonies. They bring with them a particular set of practices and traditions, Yiddish language, but particular Ashkenazi traditions. They're divided among themselves very heavily between Russian Jews and Polish Jews, and develop, both in Auckland and Wellington, quite distinct community orientations based on these differences. The next Jews come in the late 20s and 30s from Germany particularly, and late 20s from Poland, beginning in the 30s from Germany. Not a good time to come to New Zealand in the Depression, but increasing numbers of Jews do come during the 1930s. In the late 40s, again, Jews from Germany. The Jews who came from Germany tended to be better educated, brought other forms of Judaism and more modernist forms, and were a much more sophisticated community in terms of professional attainment, etc., etc. They mixed very, very badly, if you look at histories of Jews in New Zealand, with the second generation of Russian Jew and Polish Jewish migrants. In 1956, Jews came from Hungary, but they came from Hungary in a rather different situation because and a small number came in 67. They came from Jewish communities which had been oppressed, living under, as part of the USSR severe orbit of power, and where in Hungary there were very serious restrictions on Jewish practice, but again different forms. It's Hungarian Jews which led to the development of alternative forms of Judaism in New Zealand. Just push it forward, more English Jews came in the late 50s. In the 1960s, very, very few Jews came here, and many of those who were here left and went to Australia and Israel. In the 1980s, Jews came from the former Soviet Union in reasonable numbers to New Zealand, bringing with them often very little Jewish tradition, but the Russian arrangements that were done with the UN were that those who left weren't allowed to go to America. They could go anywhere but America. So they often had a choice between Israel or Australia and New Zealand, or Canada if they couldn't get in. New Zealand wasn't everyone's first choice. But the point I'm trying to make is from the mid-90s leading up to 94, South African Jews came bringing particularly Ashkenazi traditions, but mediated in a rather more European way than Anglo-Jewry, and we've had Israelis arrive in significant numbers since then. It's a very, very strange community because something like 30% of its number has left at any one time and gone mainly to Israel and to Australia. So you have a community that has brought generations of religious differences along with ethnic differences. All I'm trying to say is if you want to understand the Muslim community here or the Sikh community, we have at least 2 major caste distinctions, but 5 Punjabi regions of Sikhs. We have different communities that are waves of different migration that bring religious differences that we tend to obscure by seeing ethnicity and religion as rather different categories. It's bringing those together will give us a much better map. But let's look very briefly at our own religious diversity. Our New Zealand religious, ethnic and cultural diversities are advanced. We might call it hyperdiversity, where ethnicity and immigration patterns intersect with religion to create a complex map of solidarities, values and global connectedness. But how diverse are we? The Pew Research Centre's recent report, The Global Religious Landscape, is an analysis of national censuses and demographic data from more than 200 countries. Not all equally valuable data, but it's data. And these are used to create a database and develop their religious diversity index. For those who want the technical through, it's a version of the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, commonly used in environmental and business studies to measure the degree of ecological diversity or market concentration. The main difference with the Pew's Religious Diversity Index scores is that they're inverted so that higher scores indicate higher diversity. The 10-point scale, Religious Diversity Index, is divided into 4 ranges. 7 plus, which is the top 5%, have a very high degree of religious diversity. The next range, countries from 5.3 to 6.9, the next 15%, high diversity. Scores 3.1 to 5.2, the next 20%, moderate diversity, while the rest have low diversity. The scores are based, and it's an intriguing way, it's not the only model, there are 4 models I've come across, but this one's the most useful. The way in which it's calculated is the percentage of the population that belong to the world's largest religious categories, listed as Buddhist, Christians, folk religion or indigenous religion, Hindu, Jews, Muslims, other religions considered as a group, and the religiously unaffiliated. So it's interested in the size of the different interacting communities. The results for the 232 countries and territories are fascinating. The US, for example, which is so often regarded and heralded as having high levels of religious diversity, actually has a score of 4.1, and thus I calculated to be in 68th place out of the 232. Of the US population, 95% of its population is either Christian or formerly Christian, now religiously unaffiliated. Whereas all the other faiths, the non-Christian faiths in America, add up to less than 5%. So it's religiously not very diverse. Again, the UK with a score of 5.1, and in spite of the oft-repeated claims of high religious diversity, recently repeated by the current Archbishop of Canterbury, said we are the most religiously diverse nation in Europe. It's not actually true. The British score, 5.1, is only moderately diverse. In fact, 6 of the 12, according to my calculations, of the most high religious diverse countries are in our own Asia-Pacific region: Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam, South Korea, China, and Hong Kong. New Zealand's 6.2 score makes us 19th out of 232 most religious diverse places. We come in just below Japan and Malaysia, just above France and Nigeria. We're considerably more diverse than Australia, Belgium, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Sweden, Germany, Canada, and much more diverse than Russia, Israel, the US, India, Spain, and Indonesia. Let's just look at the census data they looked at to give the trends, just to give something of the impact. In the 1961 New Zealand census, 92% declared themselves Christian. It's unbelievable. 92%. The figure in 2013 is 48.6%. So a dramatic change from a country that is, it's halved its percentage of Christians. The number with non-religion was 5.5% in 1961. So there's always been a small number of people who don't declare religion, but it's now getting towards 40%. It's 38.3%. Regional differences are enormous, just as Alby wrote in his autobiography. In Wellington, where more than 45% of those under 45 declare no religion, unlike the less than 30% in godly Auckland or holy Dunedin. Very different countries. These huge transitions are what I'm referring to as the new diversity. Christians in 1961 were 93% European and 7% Maori. In 2016, New Zealand Christians come from the Pacific Islands, from Australia, South Africa, the US, South America, Korea, Taiwan, and the Middle East. That is, the diversity is not simply inter-religious, but it's also intra-religious in a way that isn't captured by Pew. In 1961, there were tiny Jewish, Muslim, and Hindu communities. Now there are sizable Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, and Sikh communities, and more than a million New Zealanders profess non-Christian religions. What I'm trying to say is our religious landscape has changed almost beyond recognition. We are becoming ever more religiously, linguistically, and culturally diverse as a nation. The new religious diversity reflects both an increasing no-religion sector, although these nuns, I want to call, to use Galen's term, I want to call them deinstitutionalized religiously, in that the studies, I've engaged in 2 separate studies asking group in Wellington students and non-students who declare themselves as nuns, but only about 12% of them are actually atheists. So it's a very small, I mean, Dawkins-type atheists. The rest see themselves as spiritual, see themselves as open, and some of them, in the little questionnaire I did, we have some very, very confused people who pray, but say they don't think there's any higher being, etc., etc. Anomalous, an increasing diversity. But many of these people are simply deinstitutionalized and that they don't affiliate anywhere. Some of them, one of the questions was, are you interested in religious issues? And about 2/3 of people who declare none on the census are interested in religion, so it's a strange thing. We were hoping they were going to come and study with us, but it doesn't work quite that directly. There is some evidence in the New Zealand situation that religious communities are registering greater commitment. I took part for the Jewish survey of Auckland 2 years ago, and while the overall numbers are really stable, the reported levels of practice, that's how Jews measure commitment rather than tendencies, are increasing. So smaller overall religious numbers, but there may be higher levels of commitment as measured by, in this case, observance. The EU President has recently acknowledged that, quote, interreligious and intercultural understanding are still at the very top of the current EU agenda, alongside, and he said, of equal significance to migration and the Brexit and Euro crises. So that's to give some idea of the dimensions of religious diversity. Heiner Bielefeld, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, insists, quote, it's the responsibility of governments to take the lead in developing more inclusive understandings of national identity. He continues, we need to develop a more, that's not him, that's me. We need to develop a more inclusive understanding of New Zealand national identity that reflects our bicultural heritage and increasing religious diversities. As Bielefeld stresses, every nation's priorities should include, this is him, quote, preventing feelings of stigmatization and exclusion among religious minorities. And more importantly, I think, working for more mutual understanding between different religious and non-religious groups and currents in given societies. The point I think he's making, and I agree, is we simply can't understand our society without understanding the role that religion plays in our historic and present populations. That is, we need to understand our past and present religious diversities and the dynamics of that change. Now, the new agenda of religious diversity, I should keep an eye on the time, has raised a number of pertinent issues and concerns. And I just want in the last bit to pick out some things that I've been reading and working out that reflect different dimensions of the game changing. So I'll these are issues I've briefly alluded to. The issues that concern me are the historical relationship between faith groups that are currently under reconsideration, the new understandings and definitions of religion that arise out of what I call the diversity context, and the gaps, new gaps between scholarship and religious realities. Ian Markham, in a recent lecture, is absurdly wrong when he writes, religious studies days are numbered because they've become dominated by banal, empty, circular reflections on theory and definition. He calls this the tyranny of theory. And then he says, as if it was unproblematic, when they should be out studying real religions. Now, the man is an idiot, but it's an important thing that he wants to say. He does say that he notes that religious studies arose during the 1960s as part of the Cold War, and he says as part of the Cold War development, he lists the number of departments that arose from the mid-60s, and they correlate with the tensions with the Soviet Union. So all I can say is we're rather lucky that it looks like the Cold War's back. So anyway, that's an aside. Now, a few gaps that I want to point to. Pew, back to Pew for a moment. In 2013, they did a major study, their largest work on Jewry, called The Portrait of American Jews. It was amazingly heavily criticized by the Jewish community and had wonderful headlines like Boston Globe, page 2, 57% of Jews eat bacon. It's obviously a great headline. It's a very interesting study that was universally condemned by the very community that it was meant to be studying. And so you get a very, very strange gap between what I've been talking about, the measurement of religious diversity, and the communities. And it's that gap I just want to explore for a page, and then we'll go away from it. But one rabbinic wag who summed up Pew, said, Pew discovered that there are Jews who are unaffiliated to any Jewish organization, religious or other, and have very low levels of religious observance and activity, and don't particularly highly value their Jewishness, and that many of these are included by their very permissive and inclusive definition of a Jew. Who's surprised? So, I mean, the issue was they're wonderful. They said anyone who thinks they're a Jew is a Jew, different from community definitions. Very nice, self-designating. It's like the census. But then it turns out that, guess what? People who don't join synagogues and don't observe anything tend not to value their Jewishness, which is really interesting. Okay, now, The issue that I want to raise now is a very strange one, but it's meant as an illustration of this gap. Last week, a Vic staffer from another faculty wrote to me and said, I'm very interested in Kabbalah. I'm a Rosicrucian. They're in the business school, I shouldn't say that. And they're very interested, they wrote about Kabbalah. Now, it raises really interesting questions about the relationship between scholarship and religious hyperdiversity. What do I know about Jewish mysticism? Well, nothing. I went to a shiur for one term with Louis Jacobs, in which we read Kodovra's Toma Devra, which is a 16th century systematic text, and it was lovely to read. I'm not a mystic. I understand the Hebrew, but I never understood what the text was really about. You need to know what Lurie is about to understand Kodovro, but it was interesting. I attended a rabbi's tish last time I was in Israel in Bnei Brak, Friday night ceremony, and saw a particular famous rebbe or spiritual leader. I visited the Satmar and Lubavitch centers in New York, and I went to the Bratislava center in Jerusalem 4 years ago. But my only certainties beyond these experiences are based on academic scholarship, largely of Gershon Scholem and his later followers and critics. So I do know something about Jewish mysticism, but it's by academic scholars. His major trends in Jewish mysticism is almost a religious text for Jews. Scholem based his brilliant historical studies, he provides the first systematic map of the field, on textual studies largely based on obscure manuscripts and libraries around the Western world. Huge impact he had on Walter Benjamin, and through him on Glandon, Levinas and Derrida, and a host of contemporary political messianists. Also a huge impact on Zionism, and his understanding of the role of mystical practice and beliefs shapes his particular version of Jewish history. It's hard to overstate Scholem's significance, but Scholem had no interest at all in living Kabbalistic teachers in Jerusalem. In 1925, he left Germany and left Berlin and went to Israel. Rabbi Shol HaKohen Dvik was there, Rabbi Yehuda Perea was there, Rabbi Yehuda Yashlag I'm going to come back to. Three of the great Kabbalists of the 20th century were teaching, had followers, but Scholem ignored them. He not only ignored them, but he ignored their publications. In a famous 1972 essay, he wrote, Kabbalah is history, and there's nothing new or interesting now. And it's a very strange thing. His most other famous quip was in 1941 at JTS in New York, in which he was accused. Someone said, but isn't all this mysticism nonsense? And he said, it's a very, very good point you raised. He said, nonsense is nonsense. And he said, but the accurate history of nonsense is scholarship. So anyway, I'm not a mystic. Now, it's true that in recent years, many of Scholem's findings have been challenged by people like Moshe Dell, Elliot Wolfson, Yehuda Liebs, and Charles Mopik, among others. Cynthia Ozick, one of my absolute heroes, claims that Scholem, quote, goes far beyond Freud to the very ground of human imagination. And the doyen of sublime comment, another one of my heroes, Harold Bloom, writes, for the contemporary Jewish intellectual, the Kabbalah of Gershon Scholem is now more normative than normative Judaism itself. For them, Scholem is far more than a historian, far more than a theologian. He's not less than a prophet. And he is a prophet of cosmopiety, Jewish cosmopiety. Back to the Kabbalah inquiry. The second email told me, I've acquired 3 books on Kabbalah, 2 by Philip Berg and 1 by David Berg. Now, the Bergs run the Kabbalah Center, made famous by its roti bindle, its red string, which you buy, Kabbalah water, and of course Madonna and a host of Hollywood notables. Here, like Scholem, the Bible becomes a corpus mysticum, no longer in the Kabbalah Center just for learned Jews over 40 with surviving children, but for everyone. The Bergs are interesting in that Philip Berg founded the center and is now followed by David and Michael. Philip was a disciple of his father-in-law, Yehuda Brandwein, who was a disciple and brother-in-law of Yehuda Ashlag, the rabbi I mentioned before. Ashlag wrote a very, very famous commentary on the Zohar called Hasulam, the ladder in Hebrew. And it's a step-by-step mystical path of elevation. And it's strange. It's a commentary on the Zohar. at least on the Bereshit part of the first of the 5 books on the Zohar, from a very, very strict Lurianic perspective. He was an interesting and original teacher, and if you read I bought a copy, it's very interesting to read. He was a kind of socialist, but on mystical grounds. It's a very interesting development. He is studied by some in Israel and some in America, but we have a problem. The problem is that Sholem and Ashlag disagree about everything. Historically, Sholem is right, and I want to say Madonna and the Kabbalah Center is crap New Age stuff. You know, it's strange. Berg is heavily into magic powers. An example, I got him to give me this, but I don't know if I brought it with me. Probably not. Have a look. No. No. This is the last pocket. No. Okay, oh, I've got it in my top pocket. Yes. No. And here is what my business studies colleague sent, and it's a lovely little thing. It's called Zohar Pinchas, and it's a book dedicated to the people of New Zealand, so it's dedicated to all of us. And it's from the Kabbalah Center, which has now opened up in New Zealand. It's got an introduction by Marcus Berg. It also has a chapter from the Tikkun Zohar, including the 72 names of God in Hebrew. The chapter's in Aramaic, but you don't have to worry about that, because it says just holding it and looking at it conveys divine benefit. Let me give you a quote from Rabbi Ashlag. Rabbi Ashlag said, "There is no limit to the powers that Kabbalists develop, but they are always a dangerous distraction from the ladder." This guy's into heavy magic. He is the disciple of the disciple. He's got, you say in Yiddish, real yichus, real pedigree in terms of his spiritual lineage. Now, according to, just to finish this off very quickly, according to Sholem, this text, of which there is one chapter here, was written by Moshe de Leon in the 13th century in Spain. Moshe de Leon wrote it in the name, it's synonymous, of Simon bar Yochai, a 2nd century Talmudic rabbi. He wrote it in a very strange Aramaic style, which is apparently very artificial. Just reading a little bit of there on the plane, it's hard for me to know, but I assume that the scholars are correct on that. It's a strange thing, because he claimed he discovered the text, but after he died, his wife wrote a letter in which said he'd been hours in the back room writing it. And he only claimed that he'd rediscovered it because he thought it might attract disciples and they would improve his living. So it's one of the world's great forgeries. We had a Rabbi Zeinitz in Wellington a few years ago who gave a class on this trendy Zohar, in which I asked him if it really was a 2nd century text, which he insisted, how come it refers to the rise of Islam and the medieval papacy? And he didn't bat an eyelid. He said to me, "True prophecy." Now, the truth is that it's a 13th century text. But what's really weird is the piece in here by Berg, if I can find it, which tells you about this. It's truly bizarre, this thing. It says, scan the Hebrew letters and magic will come to you. Isn't it lovely? I really like that. The Zohar is from everyone. He says, there are those who say this text was written by Moses de Leon in the 13th century. Who would know? He doesn't want to go there, but it doesn't matter because it works mystically and magically. Now, the point I'm trying to make is we've got a really weird problem of religious diversity here. We've got what for centuries was really significant, which is disciple, teacher, disciple, 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 a lineage. To claim Kabbalistic pedigree, you need to claim your yichus, your pedigree. The Bergs, currently Michael Berg, the head of the Kabbalah Center, can in 2 steps claim to be a disciple of one of the greatest Kabbalists of modern times. Even if the history is all wrong, On the other hand, you've got scholarship which has become definitive for Jewish cosmopietists and intellectuals, just as Bloom says, but it tells a completely different story. How you fit these together is really very difficult. I wrote a pointlessly silly long email to the man in the business school, and he wrote a note which just says thank you, so I think this correspondence is now over. But I said, I don't know the answer. I mean, real lineage is very, very significant and important, but so is scholarship. And it's the growing gap between what we do as students of religion and the religious diversity that I'm trying to highlight. Now, what I want to do now is just mention a few other scholars for 2 minutes and then I'm finished. David Nirenberg is my current favorite scholar in Chicago. He's a genius. His Communities of Violence and his Neighboring Faiths, those are his wonderful essays on medieval Aragon and the often murderous and violent interactions between Muslims, Christians and Jews. But he writes in Communities of Violence of the co-production of religious identity. It's very, very strange. And he tracks the way in which Muslims adopted Christian language and Christian ideas and practices. Christians adopted Jewish and Muslim practices. It's what he calls the co-production of religious identity. The adaptation, these are his words, of theology's ideas and practices across community lines. What he shows definitively in Communities of Violence is that what we think of as fixed identities, Jews, Christians, Muslims, were, in his words, dynamic, changing, shifting, porous, challenged and challenging. It's very hard to pinpoint something and say this person is Christian, this person is Muslim with clear boundary lines. In terms of definitions, in a recent essay of his, What is Islam? And in brackets, what is Christianity, what is Judaism? He insists that as a historian, orthodoxies and orthopraxies just don't exist. And he goes through a list of definitions of what you might want to define, the ways in which you might want to define Judaism or Islam in terms of creeds, in terms of practices, in terms of beliefs, and then gives counterexamples as a historian to all of them. And so the issue here is what he says is, he writes of Muslim poets who extol wine in Arabic and Farsi, of sculptors who depict the same in artists, the tensions of diversity and unity, this is him, the myriads of local Judaisms, Islams and Christianities. His last essay in Neighboring Faiths takes us into the contemporary world. He says, as a historian, they're no more fixed, these identities, by elite formulation than they ever were. But it's that which we've tended as scholars of religion to forget. Now, the last thing I was going to do, but I'll just do it very, very quickly, was mention Daniel Boyarin. Boyarin's recent work, his recent book, is truly amazing. He's a very brave scholar because he's now completely rubbished his own Borderlines 2004 book and just says, I got it all wrong. His older argument was simply that in the 4th century, the category of religion was invented and Jews and Christians were one part of it. His new thesis, which only exists in lecture form, he sent me a recent lecture, is a very interesting one, but it's a rather different and much more radical thesis. And the thesis, he says, arises out of his reflections on contemporary identities, which is the diversity link. But he goes back and he simply wants to say the church in the 4th century, in its new guise as the ecclesia, this collective body, invents Judaism. And it's nothing to do with Jews, it's entirely to do with church self-definition. And he shows quite convincingly that Jews don't use the term, they don't know what it means. They use it to mean the ways of the Judean, but they don't use it as a category. And he's got some lovely examples of Jerome versus Augustine, both accusing the other one of being a Jew and of Judaizing. It's rather a kind of internal debate. But what he goes on to say is simply that it's not until the early modernity, it's not till the late 15th century that Jews even use the term Judaism. And it's not till the late 18th century that they use it regularly as a formal way in terms of community. And so we're born back. I was going to talk about Jonathan Sacks, Not in God's Name, but I've gone on very, very long. Let me just tell you about a new Jewish field and then a final note. The new Jewish field that has arisen is fascinating. And it's a field which I want to look at as a scholar, which is a serious engagement with religious diversity. And there are two scholars who are academics and rabbis who come to mind, Alan Brill, and they're also Alan what's his name? Goshen Gotz. No one should have a name called Goshen Gottsheim, but that's his name, in Jerusalem. And both of them have been very, very good at creating a kind of matrix of understanding, of historical understandings of religious diversity. Of course, they're utterly motivated by contemporary diversity. The other person I need to say is Rabbi Daniel Sperber, who I saw last year as well, who works at the Chief Rabbi's office, who was terribly concerned because the Talmud forbids Jews to undertake business agreements with idolaters, with those who practice avodah zarah, evil worship, whatever it means, weird worship or something like that. So you can't do business with idolaters. Well, he was terribly, terribly anxious, the chief rabbi, that so much of the Tel Aviv cyber corridor deals with India, particularly with Bombay, over programming and the development of software. And many of the companies involved in the software development are Orthodox companies. And so they sent someone out from the Chief Rabbi's office to India to meet Hindus, to try and give a legal judgment on whether Hindus, all of them, were idolaters. When I met him, he went to India. He was meant to go there for 3 weeks, but he spent 9 months there. And he wandered around, he had a lovely time, and he wrote a 120-page report for the Chief Rabbi's office in Hebrew, which I have a lovely copy of, which comes to the conclusion that there are some serious idolaters in India. And you shouldn't do business with them. But he found almost everyone in the IT industry was actually a God-fearing person, and they were perfectly good to deal with. So religious diversity has many dimensions. That's where it hits the civic and the rabbinic. Now, there are also works of advocacy like Rita Grosser's work and Laurie Bierman. Rita Grosser's new book, Religious Diversity, What's the Problem? Buddhist Advice for Flourishing in Religious Diversity, is a book of advocacy and a rather cherry-picked Buddhist tradition to support contemporary religious diversity. Laurie Berman's just much smarter, I think, than Rita Gross, and has she's developed something which she sees as a kind of deep diversity, which is a new book which focuses on going beyond management of religious diversity, but both our works are advocacies. Eck also insists that we acknowledge as scholars our own diversities, and she makes a huge part in the last of her the Gifford lectures in 2009. Now, I was going to go back to Putman and Wuthenow, who's done the finest audit of America's ability to respond to the challenges of religious diversity. But last paragraph. New religious demographies, nationally, regionally, and globally, has led to a contemporary rewriting of the context of religions. The significance is that often the beginnings of the rewritings of who we are and they are, impact on us all. The strains of new religious diversity on interpersonal institutional levels are increasingly evident. Central government projects of how to manage religious diversity, central concern for successful functioning of religiously diverse societies, almost all of them now, a number of related areas of research, demographic diversity of migrant religions in formerly Christian majority countries, the decline of institutional Christianity, the increase of the nuns, the actual religious and spiritual lives, or what I increasingly call the half-lives. It's a bit like radiation. If you don't have religious parents, the chance of, or religious experience, the chance of being religious drops amazingly rapidly. But we have to think of our posters and our own culture, just as Leinfeld said. Lydia Ko was the year before last the Young New Zealander of the Year. Sonny Bill Williams is a Muslim All-Black and moral objector to what he sees as immoral banking and investment practices. We and they, the challenge of religious diversity. Albert Moore. Alby was probably the last Eliadean. He managed to continue the traditions of Eliade with a kind of faith in Eliade, way beyond the critiques of Eliade that exploded in the late 70s and early 80s. Not particularly, but not only his political career, his political affiliations, but increasingly the quasi-theological nature of his enterprise, of his notion of the sacred. In Arts in the Pacific, in the Religion of the Pacific, page 192, Alby writes, quote, "The study of religious art is enriching of local cultures by taking them out of the parochial and providing a global context." I think that's true of our study and understanding of religion in New Zealand too. The study of religious diversity at the lived level should do exactly that, provide a global context beyond the parochial. As scholars of religion, we're often in a unique and moral position in that we have access to and knowledge of diverse traditions that relativize the prejudicial pluralisms of the past. It's a very strange thing. I play poker once a week, and so this is a cards analogy. But it's as if, our traditions only know the clubs, and then only know the cards from ace to 5, or from 9 to king, or we only know the hearts, or the diamonds, or the spades. We don't yet have the whole pack of cards, but as scholars, we have a strange awareness that there are other suits and other cards, and there is this new religious diversity. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, if there are questions, I think you probably wanted to handle them.
Thank you.
It would be useful for the recording if you could repeat the question.
Oh, okay.
Summarize the question.
I can do
that.
It's your turn.
I have a question.
Okay. Good.
One of the issues that has been provoked for the academic study of religion by religious diversity in different contexts has been challenges from religious communities about the way that they are represented in the university. The most striking case of that, probably in New Zealand and locally, was Hubert Cloud, which fortunately most of the criticism of him was coming from overseas. But are we beginning to see evidence of that in New Zealand?
It's a tricky, it really is a tricky issue. It has a prehistory for McLeod. The Morton case in Auckland you're probably familiar with. There's been a long tradition of people using platforms for varieties of purposes. But the bigger issue you raise is simply, I've been writing a report for Crown Law about religious education in New Zealand. What's really strange is, if you look at the New South Wales way of doing it, which is that they've subcontracted to licensed religious practitioners to teach religion in schools. And so you have to do 2 religions if you want to do your higher end studies in religion, which means that you've got to listen to at least 1 church minister, 1 Buddhist priest, or functionary that's registered, or the local rabbi. The difficulty looking at them is it's a kind of religious literacy project in the Steve Prothero way. You need some facts, you need some stuff, but it's given from a kind of the perspective of the faith communities. I think this is a really bad way to do religious studies, and it's because the average Catholic priest only knows that there are spades, and he doesn't realize there's a context in which we operate. The only thing we have going for us as scholars, is to be able to have a perspective that moves, in Alby's words, from the parochial to the global, and that sets it in a rather different context. We have, in the teaching, I teach 113, What is Religion at Vic. We have religious functions come in, and they get terribly upset. We have the local rabbi coming in, and I say to the students, this is your weekly data. You don't have a reading this week. Your reading is Rabbi Mizrahi. And he doesn't mind. We do this with the Presbyterian minister, and they are perfect data. And they have a kind of link and authenticity about the tradition that we aren't trying to ape or reach. That's not my job. My job is not to tell you how the world looks like from the Orthodox rabbi in Wellington. He can tell you. But what is important is that we then take that material, which we do in the next class, and we look at his claims. We look at the material, we look at what he leaves out, we create a context for his own lineage and his own traditions, and try and make sense and put him into a religiously diverse position. So no, I think the worst thing we can do, we need to be guided. He speaks for the tradition as an elite member of that tradition in a way that we shouldn't ape. But that's not what we're doing. We're not engaged in a process of formation. There is a shiur that I go to that he teaches, a textual class, which is about formation, which is fine. You can become a better Jew studying texts with your rabbis on a Tuesday night. That's good stuff. But that's formation. And then he does have the authority and the word. It's difficult. Being a scholar of religion is really very, very difficult. In that we're constantly brought up by what I see as the gap between the reality of those Judaism, Christianities, Islams, Buddhisms, etc., which is religious diversity, and the kind of scholarly formations. If the gap is too great, and I think the Sholom's inability to deal with contemporary Kabbalah is probably a deep blindness and a real problem as a religious anthropologist, but also as a religious historian. So we need to be attuned to that difficulty. But as a general principle, no, I think people, unless you're engaged in religious formation, which is a different entity. But I'm not sure that's what you're doing, is it? Okay.
This is perhaps an unfair question, but you're someone who I think is one of the few people who could address it, which is that, I mean, one of the great things the points that you make here that I really resonate with is the idea that, there's two religious diversities that we're talking about. There's the world religions, religious diversity that is so prominent in liberal thinking about religious difference and indeed in policy making. And then there's, you refer to it as super diversity, but intra-religious diversity, lived religion, high religion diversity, whatever you want to say. And that these two models of religious difference pose certain problems to each other. So on one hand, it's great. Now we know that there's other types of people living with us, but as soon as we mobilize that kind of knowledge, be it in policy or education, we run into the problem of who is going to represent that religion and what version of that religion is going to be represented, and therefore you have this problem of dominance or misrepresentation, whatever it is. And so then we can say, the solution to that is to talk about super diversity or the diversity within. But that doesn't play well in policy circumstances. It's very hard to implement or mobilize as a strategy for thinking about society or indeed acting in society. So what do we do?
It's a very nice encapsulation of the problem I've been struggling with. That was good. Much shorter. But that's exactly the issue. I mean, the issue is that gap. But I don't think we should despair because it depends. We have to just be, policy is only significant if we know what we're doing. It's very, very strange talking to Crown Law because they have to write a ministerial paper about religious education. And they've got problems about religious education in the country. It's partly a scheme that still operates that raises other issues in terms of legal disputes over human rights, over discrimination, etc., etc. And it's been a practical system that goes back to Alby's MA thesis, but we just have to be certain what we want to do. And what I said to the head of Crown Law is very, very simple. If you want to do a ministerial directive about religious education, you've got to know what you want to do. If you want people to be more proficient at living in a religiously diverse culture in relation to, and you have to have some end, looking at the evidence for knowledge and lowering of tension between religious communities, that's a perfectly legitimate aim. If you want, as when I ended up on the Herald editorial 3 weeks ago by saying that I thought the syllabuses by which the Christian Education Committee use, are just hideously awful. They're most valuable as a kind of, my view, as a kind of prophylactic, as a kind of injection. You get a bit of Bible in schools and the students I meet can't remember a thing about it except they didn't want any more of it. They do it really badly. But if the minister's intention, is to give everyone access to the dominant culture, the Bible stories, the Christian elements within New Zealand history, that requires a completely different syllabus. I mean, it's not that there is a policy about religion. Now, we have directives at the university for the teaching of religion, which we've agreed. I mean, which is to give students a greater awareness, to teach them about, I teach the honours course on religious diversity, is to look at religious diversity. But the aims of that course they're a far cry from any of the existing pedagogical aims for the ministry or Crown Law. But so I don't think it's impossible, you just need to know what you want to do. The difficulty is that there are very different voices who have radically different notions of what we want to do. When the head of the Christian Education Commission said something that he now denies, that junior schools in New Zealand were an unexploited mission field, that's a very, very particular statement of what we want this education to do, which is to create the next generation of evangelical Christians. Now, I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong is something else, but to not do that openly is problematic for me, which was my criticism of the syllabus. So if you want to do that, let's debate that as a public issue and whether we think that's a public good. If we don't, then we need to be very sure about it. And part of the difficulty is simply that we're amazingly unclear. Part of that legacy of the Nelson system has changed. There's some good news. The number of students doing NCA level 2 and 3 religious studies, I mean, has gone up 5-fold in the last decade. And the schools, secular schools and Catholic schools, are increasingly teaching religious studies. The difficulty with the religious studies syllabus is it's not very much like the religious studies we do at Vic, or maybe that you do here, in that it's almost entirely based on belief. It's a very Protestant version of the syllabus, and so doing two religions by comparing their essential beliefs isn't the only way that you can study religions. But its aim is non-formational. So there are, even if taught in a Catholic school. So I think what we need is a different sort of debate about religious diversity. And why I laboured the Eck piece, because after the AR session I went for a meal with her and some of the other people, and she's really serious that America's model is going to change the religions of the world in a positive way. And I think it's a laudable aim. I don't think it's a religious studies aim, and she's very clear and consistent about it. And that might be the claim we want to do, which is that we want the members of minority faith groups, and that includes everyone now, the Christians, the Jews, we want them to operate in a religiously in a human rights regime. I think that's a perfectly laudable aim to be debated. So I don't despair with you. I don't think these are endlessly lost. I think you need to know with a degree of clarity how to discuss this, how to raise this as a public issue. The difficulty we've done is we've been deceitful. We have had hidden agendas. We have historical legacies. We have, and deep anxiety. One of the things that when I did that thing for the Human Rights Commission, was interviewing the trustees and interviewing parents who say very strange things. We had a Wellington mother who said, I don't want my son Tom to sniff glue in Cuba Mall. And that's why I'm sending him to the Christian education classes. Now, the links weren't clear, but that's what she said. I mean, she wanted her son to have some morality, some guidelines, some restrictions, and she didn't want him to be, one of those kids who hangs out in the mall. So I don't know. These are, I think that's a good point too, but I mean, we need to consider the effective ways of doing it, the ministry is not going to take responsibility for this, and religious diversity is increasingly problematic because I've been trying for the last 2 years to have what's called a government point of contact. There isn't anyone who deals with religion. And so part of the difficulty is that we did for a while have for 2 months someone, but they left and they've never been replaced. And there isn't a particularly high interest in religion more generally. I mean, it's a problematic category in New Zealand. Are you religious? No. I mean, New Zealander is a very serious response to a question. And so debating religion in public, I mean, is a problematic thing in a way that it's overdone in the States. And in Britain, because of the Anglican legacy, I mean, there are spaces for it. We're much more like France in a strange way, which is that we've privatized religion very heavily. So I don't know if that answers. But I don't think you need to be that negative.
Okay, and we can disagree on it.
Yeah. Okay, be that negative.
Is there time for a comment? Sure. I'm fresh from the conference of the Society of Translators and Interpreters, and I'm having brain explosions the whole time because we had 4 keynotes, and it was all about diversity, language diversity. And when you said governance, more brain explosion because, and when you talked about like the ethnic subdivisions, if you like, within the word. But with language, though New Zealand has been a bit behind in terms of language policy, but we do have, unlike you're saying that you've got religious contacts in government. So there's a lot of research now, and it's so similar to this thing because they no longer look at, oh yes, we have this and this many languages measured in the census, because it's way more nuanced. They talk about language communities and how we use it. And the Auckland, they use super diversity, not hyper, but whatever. Auckland is 4th in the world. I couldn't believe it. I would have thought Toronto or something. No, New York, Johannesburg, Singapore, and then Auckland for language and ethnic something diversity. But there are just so many parallels with religion. So maybe religious studies, if you could link to commerce and governance, there will start to be language. We have Ministry of Business and Innovation and Internal Affairs and all are there with us because they have to now acknowledge translators and interpreters as part of their world in a way that obviously not yet.
No, it's beginning. I've got a meeting next Tuesday with Peter Hughes and the State Service Commission looking at religious diversity and how it might impact across different ministries and departments. So, no, I mean, these things are happening. And they can happen here because of issues of access in a way that's much more difficult.
Lots and lots and lots for the DHBs and health access via language and culture and also obviously religion.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Hot topic.
Yeah. It is one of our diversities.
I'm going to kick you out.
Okay.
Stop there. If you have more questions, I'm sure Paul will be around for a few minutes.
Yeah.
But please join me.
Thank you.